Doesn't saying that there must be an intelligent designer behind nature commit the God of the gaps fallacy? Don't the laws of nature explain why the world is the way it is and how life arose on the earth? While many people might think that design arguments for God's existence died out after the advent of Darwin's theory of evolution, design arguments for God have been making a comeback in recent years. Among these arguments is the argument from fine-tuning, and in this video, I'm going to explain the fine-tuning argument and show how it is defended. So once again, I hope you'll stick around and join me as we show how nature points to God's divine power and intellect. Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, like I said, we are going to be doing the argument from fine-tuning. So in the last lecture, we talked about design arguments in general, and I discussed 3 arguments, including William Paley's watchmaker argument, Aquinas's fifth way, and in this lecture, I was going to be talking about the fine-tuning argument in detail. Just like how I went in detail in the Kalam argument after we discussed cosmological arguments, this was the design argument I wanted to focus on and show you guys how it works. So for this lecture and the last lecture, our kind of adopted Bible passage is Romans chapter 1, verse 20, and the passage says, "For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse." So I just said a few words about that in the last lecture, so if you are interested in that passage and how it's relevant to design arguments and the argument from fine-tuning, I suggest you go listen to that lecture as well. So our questions for reflection for this lecture, I've got a handful. Our first one is, some people say we shouldn't be surprised that the parameters of the universe allow for life, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be here in the first place. This is known as the truism objection. Do you think this is a good objection to the fine-tuning argument? Another one is, can reasoning in the Kalam argument help us disprove multiverse theory? I'm going to be talking about multiverse theory in this lecture, so you can be thinking about that. Keep that in mind as we go along. Another discussion question is, can postulating the infinite multiverse theory be damaging to the assumptions of science or how we view causality in the world? Why or why not? And the last one is, do you think a multiverse would need a beginning? And we've already kind of touched on that, but some of these we haven't, so you can keep those in mind as we go along in this lecture. So, I touched briefly on what fine-tuning is in the last lecture, okay? But as I showed you in the last lecture, here is our contemporary formulation of the argument from fine-tuning. And this is the way that you will see William Lane Craig present and defend this argument. And it says, premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. 3, therefore, it is due to design. Now, before I get started in all that, I wanted to be really careful to define what we mean by fine-tuning. Because when you get into this debate, you'll see that a lot of times people who object to the fine-tuning argument do so on the basis that they're not sure what. It's not that they're not sure of what fine-tuning is, but fine-tuning can be a sticking point for a lot of people, and it can create misconceptions. Okay. And some people think that when we start talking about fine-tuning, it's a loaded word, as if we've been assuming that there's just design and that God exists from day one, from step one, okay? So it's important to define what you mean by fine-tuning when you talk about it, because it does sound like a teleologically loaded term, right? But here's my definition from it, from William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith, which is actually one of the books that I have which is one of the books that I have recommended several times throughout these lectures. Craig defines it as, so he says, fine-tuning is small deviations from the actual values and quantities of the constants of the physical laws of nature would render the universe life prohibiting. That's what we're talking about when we talk about fine-tuning, okay? In Dr. Douglas Groothuis' Christian Apologetics book, he puts it this way. He says on page 248, this simply means that many aspects of the universe are closely calibrated and make human life possible. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about fine-tuning. We're not assuming that God has done all this. We are just making a matter-of-fact statement that there are constants in the laws of nature, and if these constants aren't determined by anything within the laws themselves, and if the constants were a little bit higher or a little bit lower, life couldn't exist in the universe. Okay, and let me show you some examples of that. Newton's law of gravity, for example, is you can list it out mathematically as F equals G times m1 times m2 divided by r squared. Okay, and in this equation, F stands for the magnitude of the attractive force. Okay, our m1 and m2 are in a parentheses together. That's the mass of two objects. R squared, the R stands for the distance between two objects, and the G stands for the gravitational constant. Okay? That gravitational constant, by the way. So, I say this all the time, but I'm not a scientist, so I'm not sure how they came up with this equation. But just like any other thing, I'm sure it had to do with a lot of experiments and seeing how all this works mathematically over and over and over again. What happens is the scientists have discovered that the gravitational constant just is what it is. All these other things can change. The magnitude, the mass of the two objects, obviously the distance of two objects, but for one, there's nothing that determines what the gravitational constant is. It just is what it is. You just have to plug that number in there. It's never going to be something that's going to change in your equation. And like I said, they found that it is that thing. Now, but as far as this constant goes, when we talk about fine-tuning, especially with the gravitational constant, physicist P.C.W. Davies explained that if the gravitational or weak force constants were to be changed by 1 part in 10,100, which that's just another way of saying basically 0.0001. If it went up by that much or lower than that, life would be impossible in the universe. Gravity would make it so that life would have never formed, and none of us would be here right now. So that's what we're getting at when we talk about fine-tuning. In all these laws of nature, you'll find these constants like this. Nothing determines what they are. Scientists have just discovered what they are over the years. And if these were a little bit higher or a little bit lower, none of us would be here. And just to give you an idea, and when we talk about how this is determined and how you find these constants in the laws of nature, there are constants that you find in all the major, in all the fundamental forces of nature, for example. So in the electromagnetic force, you have the electromagnetic coupling constant. There's the gravitational coupling constant in gravity. There's a weak force coupling constant in the weak force, and there's a strong force coupling constant in the strong force. I've got all those listed here. I could say them, but it wouldn't really mean much. But these with these fundamental laws of nature, there's also interesting things about this as well. So yeah, like I already said, that if the weak force was changed by just 0.0001, if it was higher or lower, or if the gravitational constant was higher or lower by 0.0001, life wouldn't be possible. What else is there? It's not just in the forces though. Okay, there's other factors that if they changed by just a little bit, we wouldn't be here. The expansion of the universe, for example, is just another one that doesn't necessarily have to do with the cosmological constants, but the expansion of the universe, for example. So Hubble's law states that every galaxy is moving from the Earth at a proportionate speed according to its distance, right? Hubble's law is mathematically formulated as, and I should have had a slide for this, but V equals h 0d. Okay, V stands for velocity, h0 is the Hubble constant, and d is the distance a galaxy is from the Earth. Or it would be d could be the distance from any particular observer. In that equation, the Hubble constant is just another constant that is not determined by anything. And another arbitrary parameter of the universe is the density of the universe. And thinking about the expansion, the density of the universe, an example of how these work is Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, estimated that if the expansion rate had decreased by 1 part in 100,000 million, that's 0.0 with 19 zeros and a 1 at the end. So if the expansion rate had decreased by 1 part in 100,000 million, 1 second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back in on itself a long time ago. And all that has to do with the density and the expansion of the universe. But the density and expansion of the universe are not determined by any of the laws of nature. They just are the certain levels that they're at, okay? So that's what we are getting at when we talk about fine-tuning. We're just matter-of-factly stating that there's certain constants found in nature, and they are just at these just right levels to allow for life, and there's nothing in nature that determines that they ought to be at those levels. They just are what they are, okay? And that not only explains what we mean by fine-tuning when we go to defend premise 1, but also it kind of already is, in explaining what that is, it actually gets you halfway through defending some of this. So again, let's just talk about this. So premise 1 of our argument says the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2 says it is not due to physical necessity or chance. The conclusion is therefore it is due to design. So let's talk about how we would defend premise 1. Obviously, it's really important to define what you mean by fine-tuning, so whoever you're talking to knows what you're saying. So premise 1 is giving 3 choices. This fine-tuning of the universe is either due to physical necessity, chance, or design. Now, whenever you are defending arguments or critiquing an argument, reviewing an argument, seeing if it's logical, seeing if the premises are true. If you are presented with an either-or statement of any kind, whether it's a choice between 2 options or 3 or more, you always want to make sure that you're not being given like a false dilemma or just a list of things that isn't exhaustive. If there's a 4th choice here, then our premise 1 would not be true because there could be another option that we're not considering. Now, having said that, whenever I look at this list, when we ask ourselves, why are these constants fine-tuned for life? Why are they at just the right amounts? What are all the possibilities for that? This is saying that it's either because they necessarily are at those levels for some physical reason, or they're just at those levels by chance, or they were designed from outside. Now, if you can think of a 4th example, I would like to hear it, but I personally think that does sound exhaustive, and there isn't any other reason why those things, why the fine-tuning can be the amounts it is. So I honestly, in my time learning about this argument, I haven't heard anyone spend too much time saying that they don't think premise 1 is an exhaustive list. Usually, the arguments are mainly against the very concept of fine-tuning itself, because people will think that it's got loaded language in it, where you're basically already assuming that God has designed the universe in your first premise. Okay, So that's why you just have to be careful to explain that fine-tuning doesn't have a design concept built into it. It's just this matter-of-fact statement that the constants are at just the right levels for life, and there's no reason for that, okay? So you shouldn't get too much pushback for premise one, and I think it is exhaustive. I think those are the only three options. It's either physical necessity, chance, or design, okay? Now, in premise two, you need to rule out, and the way this is defended is, premise two says it is not due to physical necessity or chance. So you explain why the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity first, or you could do chance. It's either way, but just the way it's listed, I'll talk about physical necessity first. But honestly, I've already been talking about that, right? It is known that these cosmological constants are at just the right levels for life, but there is nothing in nature that determines that they ought to be that way. So it doesn't seem like these fine-tuning is due to physical necessity. Now, having said that, someone, if they're scientifically minded, they might mention that it's possible that one day scientists are trying to come up with what they call a theory of everything, also listed as a TOE. And someone might say, well, one day someone might come up with a theory of everything, and it probably would explain why those constants are the levels they are. Now, if someone were to say this in response to it not being due to physical necessity, you can tell them that even though these theories of everything sound like they're going to explain everything, scientists actually understand that these theories aren't going to literally explain everything, right? They're actually just meant to explain all of the four fundamental forces of the universe through one force and one particle. Basically, these theories of everything are just trying to unify the four major forces of and basically explain the four forces of nature through one force and one particle, if that makes sense. And so far, the closest we've even come to a theory of everything is something called string theory. But now it's not relatively new. Like, it's been around for a while now. String theory is, and scientists have studied it. Theoreticians have been looking at it, and but if you don't know much about string theory, or if you've never heard of it, string theory postulates that our universe is made of 11 dimensions. And the most fundamental particle, to my understanding, is these little two-dimensional strings. That, I don't know. It seems like every time I've seen a picture of them, they just look like these little rings, but they're supposed to be two-dimensional. They're not even. They don't even have three dimensions. And scientists understand that even with string theory, there's things that aren't explained. One of those things, for example, is why are there 11 dimensions? String theory doesn't say that there has to be 11 dimensions. It doesn't. That's just a part of the theory. There's other things too, like string theorists know that string theory doesn't entail that there's just going to be one universe in one formulation, in one configuration. The string theory actually allows for many possible universes, and in these universes there are life-permitting universes and there are life-permissive universes, such that it really starts to look similar to what we're looking at now with thinking about all the different configurations of what our universe could look like. I have this super long quote from Stephen Hawking. And even though it's really long, I thought I would just go ahead and read it because I think it's really important in this part. So Stephen Hawking, this is a paper he presented at a meeting in UC Davis in 2003. He says, even when we understand the ultimate theory, it won't tell us much about how the universe began. It cannot predict the dimensions of space-time, the gauge group, or other parameters of the low-energy effective theory. It won't determine how this energy divided between conventional matter and a cosmological constant or quintessence. So to come back to the question, does string theory predict the state of the universe? The answer is that it does not. It allows a vast landscape of possible universes in which we occupy an anthropically permitted location. So, like I said, from what I understand, string theory allows, and I didn't mention this, but string theory allows for 10 to the 500th power possible universes. And they're saying that there's only a small fraction of these are life permitting. So the even with string theory, it wouldn't explain why the universe has life in it. It's there's nothing about string theory being a theory of everything, that tells us that the universe must have life in it. So the problem right now is really tough, because we've got all these fundamental forces of nature which haven't been unified yet. They're working on unifying them through a physical theory of everything. But like I said, the best candidate for something like that so far still allows for many different universes and doesn't entail that life arises out of necessity. So it looks like very much so that the fine tuning in nature is not due to physical necessity. Okay, like we said, there's nothing about these laws that determine that these constants need to be at those levels. Now, probably the most controversial portion of defending this argument you're going to find is whenever you try to argue that the fine tuning is not due to chance. But there's a way to go about discussing this. Really, and I'm going to talk about some of the numbers. I'm not exactly sure how they come up with some of these numbers, but there's just great ways to talk about it. Long story short, one thing I've heard is that if you went up to a whiteboard or a chalkboard in a really large classroom, and you just took your chalk or your marker and you put one dot on that board, the white space or the green space on those boards would represent all the universes that we could possibly have that wouldn't allow for life. And that one little dot in that huge space would represent all of the universes that would be life permitting, all the possible universes that would be life permitting. And that can just give you an idea of how vastly improbable it is that our universe is life permitting. And it would be improbable if you rolled the dice numerous times, but for all we know, and like I said, when we were looking at the cosmological arguments, looking at the Kalam argument, we talked about how there's these oscillating models of the universe. Maybe there's an infinite number of Big Bangs. For all we know, the Big Bang has only happened once, right? That's the only evidence we have. Our universe came into existence one time. So it's not just the fact that even if you were rolling the dice, the probability of having a life permitting universe is super low. It's also the fact that it's only happened once, and it just so happened to hit all those constants at all those just right levels, and life is here. Okay, so you can explain it that way. Another way you can explain it is by using something. So this is I was going to use a concept called specified complexity, which comes from William Dembski, who is a intelligent design theorist. I get this definition from a book called The Design Revolution that William Dembski wrote in 2004. It says, excuse me, I've got my parentheses here. This definition is from Douglas Grotius's Christian Apologetics. Specified complexity, and it says here, a concept used in intelligent design arguments to indicate a state of affairs that is both improbable and specified. Okay? I've got what I have listed under this is what's called William Dembski's design. It's his matrix to infer design. You ask yourself, when you're looking at a natural system, some system in nature, and you're trying to determine whether you should make a design inference or not, basically conclude that some system in nature must have been designed from the outside by a designer of some kind. There's three questions you ask. Is the natural system contingent? Two, is the natural system complex? Three, is the natural system specific? When you ask, is the natural system contingent, that's basically just the question of, was the is the natural system necessarily, is it the way it is necessarily? Pretty much what we just discussed when we asked if the fine-tuning is due to physical necessity. Okay, when you get to complexity, that's pretty easy. You just ask, is it complex or is it a simple system? And then third, is the natural system specific? And specific means, does the natural system have some kind of significance, some kind of meaning to us as intelligent beings? And I'll get to that in a second here as well. But what Dembski would say is that if the answer to all three of these questions is yes, then you can infer design. Okay? One example that I've heard, I think kind of gets at the heart of all this, has to do with a man named Tom getting a license plate. So, and I think, yes, I'm getting this scenario from William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. William Lane Craig, I'm asking you to imagine that your name is Tom and you're going to the DMV to get some license plate, and your birthday is on September 1st, 2004. Okay? So obviously, and I've got a Texas plate listed here. Obviously, with the amount of different combinations of letters and numbers, there's just a vast amount of possibilities of what you could get on your license plate. So if you got a license plate that just said some random combination, say KCV9370, you're not really going to think anything of it, right? But if your name is Tom and you were born on September 1st, 2004, and you get your license plate and it says Tom 9104, and you didn't ask for that or fill anything out, you are going to be extremely surprised, because so it's complex, right? There could have been any number of numbers and letters that could have came up on your license plate. It is contingent because you didn't specify and tell them that they ought to put a certain thing. So it should have been completely random. And three, it's specific because it actually has meaning to you as someone named Tom who was born in 2004, September 1st, right? So this is not only contingent and complex, it's also specific. So you would be, I think, rational to infer that there was an intelligence behind this, someone who chose, or someone was behind it in making your license plate say that specific thing. And when we turn this question to the universe, especially in light of the fine-tuning, it becomes apparent that running through our design matrix, the answer to all these questions is yes, right? Is the fine-tuning of the universe contingent? And or maybe even the universe itself. Yes, the universe is contingent. The fine-tuning is contingent. So there's nothing about the universe, there's nothing about the fine-tuning that says that it must be the way it is. The universe could have been any number of possible ways. It could have existed. It could have not existed. The laws, the cosmological constants in the laws could have been any number of things. There's nothing about physical reality that determines they have to be that way. So this is the universe, and the fine-tuning for life are contingent. Now we ask ourselves, is this natural system complex? The answer to that would be yes as well. I mean, we don't even have to talk about how complex the universe is and how complex all the different laws and the constants are, because we don't even understand all of these laws. We don't even understand the universe yet. We've got a long way to go. We talked about how they're still trying to come up with theories of everything to explain and unify the laws. We're looking at something complex. Definitely not along the lines of just like a basic piece of dirt somewhere, right? So then we get to our third question: is the natural system specific? Now, what we would say about this, if you're looking at the universe as a whole, of course we would say it is specific because it has life in it. And not only does it have life in it, but it also has advanced life. Life that is conscious, including animals and humans. And then when you get to humans, we're talking about life that is self-conscious and has free will and an intellect. Because when you look at these different, we've already talked about how improbable it would be for the universe to just come into existence with all these constants at just the right levels, right? There's so many universes that are life permissive, and there's just a little tiny bit that are life permitting. But it's not just that. Like, even within that range of life permitting universes, not all of those are going to be conducive for advanced life. So, but this is significant, is it not, for us as intelligent beings, as self-aware, self-conscious beings? We don't just understand the universe. Like, we create our own culture. We it's not that we just find meaning in a life permitting universe. In a life permitting universe, there are beings who create meaning. So it is definitely specific, and there's nothing really all that special about all these life permissive universes. There definitely is something special about and specific about a life permissive universe, right? And I just wanted to show you guys one more example to kind of get at the to get at this. So now, one objection that some people might make is, well, the thing is, we are just here, right? So if we're here, then it just happened that way. So it must have just necessarily been that way. And I wanted to talk about a scenario that'll kind of help you explain why that is an incorrect way to think about this. So, besides the whiteboard or chalkboard analogy that I've heard, I've also read that the probability of a life-permitting universe is the same as entering a lottery, okay, in which you choose a number, and the winning number is a single number among a pool of a billion numbered balls, okay? So there's a billion numbered balls, and you have to choose just one number, and you have to get it correct. That's how the lottery works, okay? So, when we think about, kind of be thinking about the explanatory filter or design filter. But let's say that the winner of the lottery that we just mentioned turns out to be the manager's son. The manager of the lottery, it just so happens that his son wins this lottery. This is just almost, it's just so improbable that really any one person is going to win that it's almost beyond impossible. Now, would we just throw our hands up and say, well, someone had to win, and since the manager's son won, it must have just been by chance. It must have just been by chance. Well, no, we wouldn't, right? Because not only is it's random. Think about the filter. It's contingent. It's supposed to be random. It's definitely complex because of the amount of balls, and it is definitely specific because there is meaning to the son winning, right? He's related to the manager of the thing. So that would be just another example. Now, but if someone says, well, it just so happens, let's put it this way. So say that you won the lottery instead of the manager's son. Uh, if you were just to say, well, someone had to win, so whoever that was, it was just determined to be that way. This objection would be like saying, well, since I won the lottery, it must have been destiny, and there was no possible way that anyone else could have won. But the thing about this is that that's obviously absurd, right? Because there were millions of other people who entered the lottery. And there would be, and obviously, like we mentioned, there would be billions upon billions of other balls that could have been picked out of the pool. If someone says, well, it just had to be that way because this is the way it is, like that is just only taking in account the one universe that's in front of us. What the problem with that objection is that it's not taking into account the numerous, vast amount of universes that are life permissive, because that's what we're looking at. We're not just looking at our one universe. Of course it has life in it, and of course in this universe there needs to be life. That's why the constants allow for that. They're that way. But if you say, well, it just is that way, so it just must be that, it just must necessarily be that way. No, it doesn't have to be that way, because there's, like we said, it's a contingent system. So there's nothing that says it has to be this way. So you just need to remind people of that. Another way to look at why we would infer that it's due to design is to look at it from like an inference to the best explanation type inference, right? So you can ask yourself, given the high improbability of a universe which only began once, remember, to have all the constants necessary to permit life, which is a better explanation? Would a designer explain a life-permitting universe better than no designer, right? To put it another way, assuming there were no designer, would you expect a life-permitting universe? And I think the answer is that you wouldn't expect a life-permitting universe without a designer, and you would expect a life-permitting universe with a designer. Right? I mean, regardless of whether the probability impresses you or not, the fact is that you can just treat it like an inference to the best explanation. Say, look, would you at least say it's reasonable to expect a life-permitting universe if there's a designer, and if there's not, to not expect one? I think that's pretty reasonable. So, therefore, it is due to design. And I think this one's a little bit easier, not as mind-bending as the Kalam, right? If we infer that there's a designer of the universe, it's got to be some kind of intelligence above and beyond physical reality that is controlling all this, guiding everything to its telos, right? And maybe even like imposing design from the outside, the extrinsic teleology. And this being would have to be extremely intelligent and extremely powerful, right? So it's really easy to infer from these design arguments that this designer must be God. I mean, some people might argue that, okay, well, we can talk about the, life arising on the earth. Maybe that was some aliens or something. But when we get into the fine-tuning of the universe and the very constants of the laws of nature themselves, it's really easy to infer that all that comes from God. Oh, and one thing I almost forgot to mention is that an objection to this that you're going to run into is multiverse theory. Some people argue that, well, if we lived in a multiverse with an infinite number of universes, the probability of us living, the probability of there being a universe with life in it is going to be 100%, because in an infinite universe with an infinite number of, in an infinite multiverse with an infinite number of universes, every single possibility is going to be played out eventually, right? So we shouldn't be surprised that we're in one, because it had to be somewhere. Now, the issue with this, though, is that there's many issues with it, and that's what I was kind of getting at. I almost forgot to mention this until I looked at our reflection questions. Is that an issue people have pointed out with if you try to explain something by pointing to an infinite multiverse, the problem is that really explains too much. It can be damaging to science because if the answer to why do we have life in this universe, why are the constants the way they are, if it's because we live in a multiverse with an infinite number of universes, so that's bound to happen, that can actually be your explanation for anything. you know why does the sun why does the earth rotate around the sun 365 days? We're in an infinite multiverse, so it's bound to happen in one of them. You can explain every single thing in reality that way, so it's really not a helpful explanation. But there's another thing that I like to emphasize is that if you kind of couple this with the Kalam reasoning, you can also show that philosophically it seems like a universe with an infinite number of a multiverse with an infinite number of universes would actually be impossible to have. You can't have an actually infinite number of universes like the Kalam talks about. So not only does this multiverse theory not really explain anything, it also can be shown to be false if you use the philosophical reasoning from the Kalam. So yeah, but that's the design argument. The argument from fine tuning. So a lot of people I talk to haven't heard of this one. They might have heard of the Kalam. It's one of the more famous. So I always get excited to get to talk about this. I don't deal with this as much as I've talk about the Kalam, but I love talking about this. It's really interesting, I think. But here's our questions for reflection again. Our first one was: some people say we shouldn't be surprised that the parameters of the universe allow for life, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be here in the first place. Do you think this is a good objection to the fine-tuning argument? So hopefully you were able to answer that through what I already discussed. The next two are: can reasoning in the Kalam argument help us disprove multiverse theory? Pretty much just explain that one. And can postulating the infinite multiverse theory be damaging to the assumptions of science or how we view causality in the world? Why or why not? And the last one is: do you think a multiverse would need a beginning? So I hope you found those reflection questions helpful. I hope you get to think about those and connect all the dots. Here's our quote to leave you with. Again, it's the same one from Frank Turek. We'll be switching out after this. And Frank says in Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case, on page 26, he says, this created and fine-tuned universe, along with the orderly cause and effect nature of reality, are best explained by an intelligent being with attributes remarkably congruent to the God of the Bible. Once again, I wanted to promote my seminary where I learned a lot of this stuff. If I ever make a mistake on any of these videos, it's not their fault, it's all mine. But Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College is in Matthews, North Carolina. I suggest you check them out if you want to go deeper into apologetics, philosophy, theology. It is a evangelical seminary, non-denominational there in North Carolina. They've got great online programs, great faculty. And I highly recommend it. I got my master's degree in apologetics and my PhD in philosophy there. Also, don't forget that they have a free resource on apologetics. They've got about a 50-page book, a PDF book that you can get from their website, ses.edu. If you go there and hover over the media tab, click on Why Trust the God of the Bible, it'll take you to this free resource that they're really excited to share with everyone, and I hope you'll check that out. Also, don't forget Kingdom Preparatory Academy in Lubbock, Texas. This is where I teach a class on apologetics every other spring. But that's not really why I talk about this. I just talk about it because I love this school and I hope it grows. It's a classical school in Lubbock, Texas. They've got a university model where your students will go to class Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So by the time they get to college, there's really no culture shock. That's what they've been doing their whole academic career, and they can do all their homework on their own. Plus, it's a classical model, so they're taught how to think, not what to think. And that's one of the reasons why I've sent my kids there, and I love it so much. Obviously, it's Christ-centered. It's a Christian classical school. So I hope you'll consider that if you are interested in a classical alternative to education. It's Kingdom Preparatory Academy. You can check out their website, kingdomprep.org, or just Google it. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture on the argument from fine tuning. In the next ones, we are going to be switching to the moral argument. So I hope to see you there, and I hope you have a great week.